dangerous prison in the world has no walls. It has no guards. It has no chains. Yet millions of people live inside it. It is the prison of uncontrolled emotion. Emotion can build movements. Emotion can ignite revolutions. Emotion can awaken sleeping nations. But emotion can also blind entire societies. When emotion becomes the ruler of the mind, judgment becomes an exile. And when judgment disappears, manipulation begins. Throughout history, the most successful manipulators have never needed superior intelligence. They only needed one thing: a crowd that feels more than it thinks. Because emotional people are easier to mobilize than thoughtful citizens. Emotional crowds do not demand evidence, they demand affirmation. They do not analyze leaders, they worship them. They do not investigate accusations, they attack the accusers. And slowly, without realizing it, societies begin to exchange truth for loyalty. Across Africa and across the diaspora, we are witnessing a silent crisis. A crisis not of resources, a crisis not of talent, but a crisis of judgment. Leaders emerge who understand how to trigger outrage, how to manufacture sympathy, how to wrap themselves in the language of justice while quietly feeding on the desperation of the people they claim to serve. Foundations are built, charities are launched, non-governmental organizations appear as beacons of hope. But behind some of these institutions lie darker realities. Behind the speeches are hidden accounts. Behind the campaigns are silent victims. And behind the applause are people who have been deceived. And yet, those who dare to ask questions quickly discover something frightening. The followers are no longer supporters. They have become defenders. An army of emotional loyalty, a cult of admiration, where criticism is treated as treason and exposure is treated as persecution. This is the word we must examine today, because the uncomfortable truth is this: when emotion becomes the highest authority, common sense becomes the first casualty. And when emotion reigns without discipline, sound judgment dies.
Strength of Africa TV presents.
In a prison with no walls, where the loudest feelings reign, crowds march to thunder, while quiet truth fills pain. Leaders rise on echoes that emotion gladly feeds, turning wounded hearts into banners for their deeds. Questions fade to whispers in a theater of applause, where loyalty is louder than evidence or laws. But when passion blinds the mind and crowns illusions thrown, a nation trades its wisdom for a hero carved of stone. When emotion rules the fire and reason fades away, crowds will cheer the shadows while the truth begins to sway. Feel the cry of justice, but let wisdom lead the way. For when common sense is silent, civilizations decay. When emotion rules the fire, reason fades away, crowds will cheer the shadows while the truth begins to sway. Feel the cry of justice, but let wisdom lead the way. For when common sense is silent, civilizations decay.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are at this moment. I'm your host, Adebayo Oladokun, and this is Strength of Africa TV, where truth meets courage, where the past is reawakened and the future of the motherland is reclaimed. Today's episode is titled, When Emotion Rules, Common Sense Dies, the Rise of Cult Leaders and Emotional Manipulation. Let's start with the throne of emotion. There are kingdoms that arise from courage. There are civilizations that grow from wisdom. But there are also nations that crumble under the rule of emotion. Emotion is powerful. It is the fire in the belly of revolution, the tears of liberation, the cry of justice. Without emotion, humanity will be cold machinery. But when emotion becomes king, reason becomes a prisoner. When emotion sits on the throne, common sense is the first casualty. History has shown it again and again. Empires have collapsed not because their enemies were stronger, but because their people were angrier than they were thoughtful. Emotion intoxicates, emotion blinds. Emotion convinces people that shouting is thinking. A society ruled by emotion becomes a drum circle of outrage where logic cannot be heard. And today, across Africa and across the diaspora, we see a dangerous pattern emerging. People are feeling more than they are thinking. Opinions are no longer built on evidence, they are built on irritation. Positions are no longer formed through reasoning, they are formed through loyalty to tribes, to parties, and to personalities. The modern public square has turned into an arena of emotional gladiators. People are not debating to discover truth, they are shouting to defend feelings. In such a climate, common sense becomes a stranger. The paradox is simple. The more emotion dominates public discourse, the less clarity a society has. And when clarity disappears, manipulation enters like a thief in the night. Let's have a look at the politics of manipulated feelings. A wise leader pursues the mind, a cunning leader provokes the emotions. The difference between the two determines the fate of a nation. Across the African continent, leaders have long understood a dangerous secret. It is easier to control an emotional crowd than a thinking citizen. Facts require effort, emotion requires only a spark. And leaders have mastered the art of lightning emotional fires. They ignite anger over ethnicity, they provoke fear about religion. They manufacture outrage over imagined enemies. Once the emotional wildfires begins, rational thinking evaporates like morning dew. The same people who demand good governance often defend bad leadership when their emotions are triggered. A leader can fail economically, he can fail morally, he can fail administratively. But if he knows how to manipulate identity and emotional loyalty, he survives. This is the psychology of political survival. People who are emotionally invested in a leader do not evaluate him with logic. They defend him like family. And in that moment, accountability dies. Emotion becomes the shield protecting incompetence. This is why nations sometimes remain trapped in cycles of failure. Not because solutions do not exist, but because emotions refuse to allow those solutions to be discussed. Now, let's examine the religion of feelings. Religion was meant to guide the conscience. But when emotion becomes the center of religion, faith turns into spectacle. Across many societies, spiritual institutions have discovered a disturbing formula. Emotion attracts crowds faster than truth. Tears draw more attention than wisdom. Miracle does more excitement than discipline. And so, religion increasingly becomes a theater of emotional experiences. Congregations are not always trained to think deeply. They are trained to feel intensely. But intense feelings do not automatically produce wise decisions. The paradox of emotional religion is profound. The more people feel spiritually high, the less they sometimes think spiritually deep. Faith becomes a performance. Leaders know exactly how to stimulate emotional reactions. Raise the music, raise the voice, raise the urgency. Soon the atmosphere becomes electric. But electricity is not enlightenment. Emotion alone cannot build moral clarity. Without critical thinking, people can become loyal to personalities rather than principles. And when that happens, religion loses its compass. Now, a look at the social media empire of emotion. If emotion were a currency, social media would be the central bank. Platforms today reward outrage, not wisdom. Calm reasoning spreads slowly, anger spreads instantly. The algorithm understands human psychology better than most governments. It knows that fear, anger, and tribal loyalty keep people engaged. So it feeds people emotions like fear into a furnace. And before long, the digital world becomes a battlefield of emotional explosions. A lie that triggers anger travels faster than a truth that requires reflection. The information age has produced the most misinformed emotional public in history. People react before verifying. They share before understanding. They condemn before investigating. And in this climate, common sense is not just silenced, it is ridiculed. Anyone who asks for evidence is accused of betrayal. Anyone who calls for calm thinking is accused of weakness. Emotion becomes the badge of authenticity. Reason becomes the enemy of belonging. Let's examine tribalism, the emotional virus. Tribal identity is powerful. It gives people a sense of belonging, heritage, and cultural continuity. But when tribal identity becomes emotional absolutism, it becomes a virus. It infects judgment. Across many African societies, tribal emotions often override national interest. A corrupt leader from one tribe may still receive loyalty. A competent leader from another tribe may receive suspicion. This is the paradox of tribal emotion. People sometimes defend the very system that keep them poor. Why? Why? Because emotional identity is stronger than rational evaluation. The tribe becomes sacred, facts become negotiable, and national progress becomes collateral damage. This emotional politics fractures societies. It turns citizens into rival camps. Instead of solving shared problems, people compete in defending collective pride. And when pride becomes policy, development stalls. Now, a closer look at the economy of compassion and the business of charity. Compassion is a sacred human instinct. When people see hunger, they want to feed. When they see poverty, they want to give. When they see suffering, they want to help. This is the beauty of humanity. But like every powerful force, compassion can be exploited. And when compassion is mixed with unquestioned authority, a strange economy begins to form. An economy where emotion becomes currency. An economy where suffering becomes a fundraising tool. Across many communities, religious leaders have expanded their missions beyond their pulpits. Foundations are launched. Humanitarian organizations are registered. NGOs are established. The purpose appears noble: help the poor, care for orphans, support widows, pay for medical treatment. The appeals are heartbreaking. Photographs of sick children, videos of families in poverty, urgent calls for donations, and the money begins to flow. Congregations give generously. Diaspora supporters send foreign currency. Social media followers share the campaigns, but sometimes behind the compassionate language, a different reality quietly emerges. The charity platform becomes personal empire. The foundation becomes a brand. The NGO becomes a financial pipeline. Not always through open theft, but through subtle, gradual justifications. The first justification is always small. The leader needs a better car to visit project sites. The organization needs a larger office for administrative work. The director deserves comfort for his sacrifices. One expense becomes another. One privilege becomes a habit. And before long, the line between service and self-enrichment becomes blurred. The vehicles bought for charity becomes personal transport. The donations meant for relief sometimes fund luxury travel. The money intended for the poor slowly disappears into administrative costs that no one fully understands. This is the silent economy of compassion, where good intentions create opportunities for bad decisions. Consider a familiar scenario. A religious foundation raises thousands of dollars for medical emergency. The story spreads across social media. People give quickly, moved by emotions. But months later, questions begin to emerge. Where did all the money go? Why was only a fraction used for the patient? Why are financial reports missing? The questions grow, but something else grows even faster. The defense of the leader. Followers rise like a shield. They do not ask for audits. They do not request transparency. Instead, they attack the question. They say, "Do you know how much good this man has done? Why are you persecuting a servant of God? Why are you attacking someone who helps the poor?" And just like that, accountability dies. Not because evidence is absent, but because emotion has become stronger than truth. This is the paradox of charity without oversight. The more a leader is praised as a hero, the harder it becomes to examine his actions. The NGO becomes sacred, the foundation becomes untouchable, the leader becomes a symbol, and symbols are very difficult to question. So, the economy continues, campaign after campaign, fundraiser after fundraiser, tears after tears. Why the poor remain poor and the organization grows wealthier. This is not the story of every religious leader. Many serve with honor, transparency, and true sacrifice. But where compassion is combined with unchecked authority, the temptation for misuse always exists. And history has shown that when followers refuse to ask questions, power begins to drift. Drift from service into privilege. Drift from charity into business. Drift from faith into enterprise. Until one day, the organization built to help the poor quietly becomes a machine that sustains the powerful. This is the economy of bad decisions, where emotional appeals open wallets. But the absence of accountability closes the door to truth. And once again, the lesson returns. Where emotion reigns, sound judgment and common sense die. Now, to the birth of cult leaders, how followers become defenders of deception. Leadership is meant to guide people, but sometimes leadership evolves into something far more dangerous. It evolves into a cult. A cult does not begin with chaos, it begins with admiration. A charismatic figure emerges, he speaks confidently, he appears compassionate, he claims to defend the voiceless. People gather at first. They are simply supporters. They attend events, they donate to causes, they share these messages, but over time, something subtle begins to change. Admiration turns into devotion, and devotion slowly turns into identity. The followers no longer just support the leader, they become emotionally attached to him. Their pride becomes linked to his reputation. Their loyalty becomes tied to his image. And that is the moment when accountability begins to fade. Because when a leader becomes an identity, criticism feels like a personal attack. A simple question about finances becomes an insult. A request for transparency becomes a threat. An investigation becomes a conspiracy. This is how cult leaders are born, not by force, but by emotional investment. The leader encourages a narrative. It's not just a person, it's a symbol of hope. It's a voice for the people. It's a target of powerful enemies. Once this story is established, the followers become soldiers. They defend him online. They attack journalists. They harass whistleblowers. They silence victims. They flood social media with praise. And slowly, an organic community transforms into an emotional army. This army does not demand proof, it demands loyalty. It does not examine facts, it protects the narrative. The more allegations emerge, the stronger the defense becomes. Because in a cult environment, evidence is not evaluated. It is interpreted as persecution. The leader becomes a martyr, the critics become enemy, and the truth becomes irrelevant. This is why cult leaders are so difficult to hold accountable. They do not stand alone. They stand behind thousands of emotional defenders. Defenders who believe they are protecting a hero, when in reality they may be protecting a system of deception. This phenomenon is not limited to politics. It appears in religion. It appears in social activism. It appears in humanitarian movements. Anywhere a charismatic leader builds power through emotion, the signs are often the same. The leader is always praised. The organization is never questioned. The followers are always mobilized, and the critics are always attacked. In such environments, truth struggles to survive because truth requires questions, and cult leaders fear questions more than anything else. The greatest threat to a cult leader is not an enemy. It is a question, a simple question. Where did the money go? Who controls the foundation? Where are the audited reports? What happened to the people we were supposed to help? These questions are not acts of hatred. They are acts of responsibility. But to a cult follower, they feel like betrayal. And so, the defense continues, the praise continues, the myth continues. Until one day, reality arrives, and history begins to write a different story. A story where heroes become figures of controversy, where foundations become subjects of investigation, where emotional loyalty collapses under the weight of facts. And in that moment, society is forced to consider a hard truth. A leader should be respected, but never worshipped. An organization should be supported, but always questioned. Because when admiration becomes blind devotion, when loyalty becomes unquestioned defense, when emotion becomes stronger than truth, that is the moment a leader stops being a servant and becomes a cult. And once again, the lesson returns. With undeniable clarity, where emotion reigns, sound judgment and common sense die. Let's examine the death of common sense. Common sense is not complicated. It is the quiet ability to separate feelings from facts. But when societies become emotionally addicted, common sense becomes unfashionable. Measured voices are drowned by passionate shouting. Careful thinking is replaced by moral theatrics. People perform outrage like actors on a stage. But performance is not wisdom. The louder a society becomes, the less it understands itself. Noise masquerades as awareness. Emotion masquerades as conviction. But beneath the noise lies confusion. A society cannot solve problems it refuses to analyze, and emotion resists analysis. Emotion demands loyalty. Logic demands humility. Let's look at the return of judgment. Yeah, there is hope. History also shows that civilizations recover when they rediscover. Judgment, sound judgment is not the enemy of emotion. It is its compass. Emotion provides passion. Judgment provides direction. Without direction, passion becomes chaos. Without passion, direction becomes lifeless. Healthy societies balance the two. They allow emotion to inspire action, but they allow reason to guide decisions. Africa's future and the future of its diaspora depends on this balance. The continent is rich with passion, creativity, resilience, and spiritual intensity, but passion must be disciplined by wisdom. Hunger must be tempered by analysis. Outrage must be accompanied by strategy. Because the harsh truth remains, where the emotion reigns, sound judgment and common sense die. But where wisdom governs emotion, nations rise. And when nations rise, history changes. My people, what about the psychology of mass hysteria? A single emotional person can make a mistake, but an emotional crowd can destroy a nation. Psychologists have long understood a dangerous phenomenon, mass hysteria. When individuals gather into crowds, the responsibility of thinking dissolves into comfort of belonging. In a crowd, people feel powerful, but paradoxically, they also think less. The individual mind becomes diluted in collective emotion. Suddenly, shouting replaces reasoning, chanting replaces analysis, belonging replaces truth. This is why mobs can celebrate things that harm them. This is why crowds sometimes cheer the very policies that will eventually impoverish them. In that moment, emotion becomes contagious. Anger spreads like wildfire in dry grass. Fear spreads faster than lightning. Suspicion spreads like poison in a river. And before anyone pauses to ask questions, the damage is already done. The more people join an emotional movement, the less anyone questions it. Because questioning the crowd requires courage, and courage is rare when belonging feels safer than truth. Across the world, and particularly in fragile democracies, emotional waves have toppled governments, destroyed institutions, and sometimes even ignited civil wars. Not because the people were evil, but because they were overwhelmed by emotion. Now, let's examine the courage to think against the crowd and the diaspora's emotional mirror. Thinking independently has never been easy, but in emotionally charged societies, it becomes even harder because disagreement is often interpreted as betrayal. When emotions dominate public discourse, people begin to fear intellectual honesty. Scholars become cautious, journalists become guarded, citizens become silent. Why? Because emotional crowds punish dissent. The more emotion controls a society, the less freedom of thought exists. True progress, however, requires intellectual courage. Someone must ask uncomfortable questions. Someone must challenge popular narratives. Someone must examine assumptions. Every major advancement in human history began with individuals who dared to think differently. They resisted emotional pressure. They resisted tribal loyalty. They resisted the temptation to belong at the expense of truth. And because of that courage, societies evolved. The African diaspora is powerful. It carries influence, resources, education, and global exposure. But the diaspora is not immune to emotional politics. In fact, distance sometimes intensifies emotional attachment. Many diaspora communities experience Africa through nostalgia, frustration, or inherited narratives. Some defend governments blindly, some defend a cult hero gullibly, others condemn the entire continent hopelessly. Both positions are emotional extremes. Distance sometimes magnifies emotion while reducing context. People thousands of miles away can become deeply passionate about issues they only partially understand. Social media amplifies these reactions. A single viral video can provoke outrage without revealing the full story. Soon, debates become polarized. One side romanticizes everything, the other side demonizes everything. But current challenges and its opportunities require something deeper than emotional commentary. They require strategic thinking. They require intellectual humility. Emotion is not the enemy, it is the fear of humanity. Without emotion, revolutions will never begin. Without emotion, justice will never be pursued. Without emotion, courage will never rise. But fuel without steering destroys the vehicle. Emotion without judgment destroys society. The true challenge is balance. A wise civilization does not suppress emotion, it educates it, it disciplines it. It directs it toward constructive goals. Africa stands at a crossroads between emotional politics and rational leadership, between passionate reaction and strategic planning, between rest and wisdom. And the choice will determine the next century. Because the warning remains timeless. Where emotion reigns, sound judgment and common sense die. But where wisdom governs emotion, nations rise, civilizations flourish, and history bends towards progress. The question now is not whether emotion exists. The question is who controls it, the people or those who wish to manipulate them. And the answer to that question will shape the future of Africa, the diaspora, and the generations yet unborn. Civilizations rarely collapse overnight. They decay slowly, first through corruption, then through complacency, but most dangerously through emotional blindness. When people begin to choose loyalty over truth, when leaders become untouchable symbols, when followers defend personalities more fiercely than they defend principles, a silent erosion begins. Institutions weaken, accountability fades, and deception finds fertile ground. History has shown that the most effective manipulators do not silence the public, they excite the public. They do not discourage emotion, they weaponize emotion. They turn followers into defenders. They turn criticism into persecution. They turn questions into attacks. And before long, the truth stands alone. The truth has one advantage: it does not disappear simply because it is unpopular. Eventually, every illusion collapses under the weight of reality. Every false hero faces the mirror of history, and every society must decide what it values more: comforting emotion or uncomfortable truth. Africa and its diaspora stand at such a moment where passion must be disciplined by wisdom, where admiration must be balanced by accountability, where compassion must be protected by transparency. Because the future of any society depends on one simple principle: feel deeply but think clearly, question courageously, and never surrender your judgment to emotion loyalty. Because the warning remains eternal: where emotion reigns, sound judgment and common sense die. But where wisdom governs emotion, nations awaken and history changes. I'm your host, Adebayo Oladokun, and this is Strength of Africa TV. If you found value in this conversation, please subscribe to our YouTube channel, endeavor to join our membership, and give us super thanks. Follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Rumble. For advert placement, visit us online at Strength of Africa TV. Watch out for the next episode. You don't want to miss it. Until then, tell your own story, because Africa's future is written in African ink. Stay rooted, stay bold, stay African. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next episode. Bye.
In a prison with no walls, where the loudest feelings reign, crowds march to thunder, while quiet truth fills pain. Leaders rise on echoes that emotion gladly feeds, turning wounded hearts into banners for their deeds. Questions fade to whispers in a theater of